Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next Facebook and LinkedIn Live, a very, very special edition today with some really special, wonderful guests here today. This is going to be probably a little bit of an intense conversation, but a really good conversation that we need to have 1 year after the murder of George Floyd. So my name is Dr. James Simmons. I am your host for our conversation today, founder of Ask the NP. Just as a reminder for those of you who are watching and tuning in, the information provided during this event is for educational purposes only. If you have any questions regarding medical conditions or treatment plans, please, of course, consult your physician or provider. This live broadcast will cover subject matter that could be difficult for some to hear today. If for anyone struggling with feelings, difficult feelings as well, help numbers will be provided. In the chat. We'll also provide them on screen for you later on. So to get the conversation started today, I have such the pleasure to introduce Dr. Robin Henderson, Chief Executive of Behavioral Health for Providence, Oregon, and Jessica Ekong, Service Area Chief Human Resources Officer at Providence. And Jessica and Doc Robin, if either of you tell us a little bit about what you do for the audience watching.
I can go first. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jessica Ekong. I'm a service area CHRO for Providence. I work in the shared services organization. So essentially my role and the role of my team is to help enable the business strategies. I have clinical care, mission, risk, and compliance. And so essentially I'm helping enable the strategy that allows Providence to become the best place to give and get care.
And I'm Dr. Robin Henderson. I'm the Chief Executive of Behavioral Health for Providence here in Oregon, which basically means if it's about behavioral health in Oregon, it reports up through me. I'm also the Chief Clinical Officer of Work to Be Well, which is our youth mental health prevention organization that really focuses on giving youth voice and choice in mental health advocacy, education, and access.
Excellent. Thank you, both of you, for that lovely introduction of yourselves. So, I think, Doc Robin, you and I have done this several times, and Jessica, it's so lovely to meet you and have you here with us. I know you've done some other conversations as well, but I think it's really important. I like to do this. I think I just want everyone to sort of level set. We're just going to breathe for a moment. I think it's important today, particularly given the topic that we're discussing and the man we're discussing and the situation we're discussing, to just take a couple of breaths in. So everyone watching with me, please, and my apologies for the phone in the background. I'm at my parents' house. I'll tell you all about that later, but a big deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth with me. One more. I know that sort of, if you're a person who practices yoga, we often talk about how that sort of unites the room. And I think it's important for us to feel united in this conversation and all sort of level set from the same place. We're also talking about trauma today, and specifically the trauma in that it has been 1 year since the murder of George Floyd. And we all, to whatever degree that is, and personal experience, our global racial reckoning that's going on, and in the middle of a pandemic, we all are carrying some significant trauma with us. So Dr. Robin, I'm just gonna start with you. Can you talk about how this trauma has looked, specifically for Providence from like a clinical standpoint?
It has been a year. And when you look at the trauma, not only in our caregivers, but in our communities, due to the murder of George Floyd and the engagement in conversation, the racial reckoning in our society, I have seen more trauma and stress reactions, not only in our caregivers, but in the patients that we're seeing and in the youth that we work with through Work to Be Well. We're seeing the interpersonal reckoning and the interpersonal trauma that comes from microaggressions and all the different types of biases, implicit biases that people bring to the table that people are developing this awareness of. And we see that so much in our caregivers, and both our caregivers, our BIPOC caregivers, but also our white ally caregivers who are trying to figure out how to navigate and not offend. And inevitably that tension and that trauma leads to stress and burnout at record levels. We see institutional trauma, the impact of institutional racial trauma through policies that a year and a half ago, people weren't even thinking were institutionally racist and are, and the reckoning that brings along as well. And all in the context of this entire set of systemic racism that we're still as a society coming to grips with. So the trauma and the impact of that in the midst of a pandemic has, I think, led to record levels of burnout and stress in our caregivers, and also record level of stress in the people that we serve. It's harder than ever to get mental health help. It's harder than ever to get an appointment with somebody, and for our BIPOC caregivers to get an appointment with somebody who looks like them, who has those shared experiences with them that they feel they can trust and deal through things with. So we got a lot of work to do, Dr. James. We got a lot of work to do.
Oh, man. I mean, do we ever? I feel like that's sort of been the theme of the conversations that have been going on now for a couple of weeks leading up to the anniversary of George Floyd's murder, which is today, right? To remind the audience, that's why we're having this conversation about this. And, I think it's so much has been great. Some things have happened, but the work is not over and not even close to being over, particularly for caregivers. And you mentioned that there's everyone is dealing with trauma in kind of their own particular way. And Jessica, I'm curious from an HR standpoint, how have you experienced this particular trauma from the company's response, and then HR level, the trauma that collectively everyone that Dr. Robin points out has gone through? How's that impacting you, and what are you seeing from an HR standpoint?
Yeah, so I wear multiple hats in answering that question. One, my lived experience in being a Black woman, being in HR and working at Providence. I think first we have to start with understanding that George Floyd was an exclamation on an experience that was already happening for many BIPOC people, but particularly Black people. So I think if we talk about the compounding effect and we start with the concept of epigenetics and how your ancestors process trauma and how that's embedded into your genes and impacts how you experience trauma. And then we layer on, the institutional experiences that you experience from the time that you're born. And then we start layering on the Tamir Rice, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, the George Floyds, the Mike Browns. So for many of us, we had been in this work, operating, protesting, operating as activists. And so I would say George Floyd was very much a tipping point where it broke many people who look like me wide open. We cried for all of those other names. And when we got to George Floyd, we were weeping, we were wailing. And it was, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and yet somehow our life still doesn't matter to the point where there are still lynchings happening in broad daylight. So I want to offer that context of that is the lens of how some people were experiencing this. And so I saw a myriad of things. I saw people just completely just break down. There were some people who found solace in having open sessions and sharing their experience. And so we saw communities who historically are very private and don't show emotion at work, crying on Zoom in Teams and blue jeans because they could hold it in no longer. But then we also saw people who felt like they still needed to wear a mask or cover. So there's this concept of covering where you downplay or minimize a part of yourself so that you can maybe fit more into the culture. And so those people were essentially suffering in silence, but wanting to be seen. And so, that tension was there of, we saw a lot of individuals on screen like this, it was just another day, because that's how people feel like they have to show up. And then when you talk to them off on the side, people were just not okay, disengaging from many social activities, disengaging from their friends and family members, just replaying, could this be me? Could I be next? Could this be my brother? Could this be my uncle? And so ruminating on those thoughts. And then to your point, Dr. Henderson, then looking for care. The process, even for myself, of looking for a Black female mental health professional in the state of Oregon, my God, it was an act of God. And I looked up and found the last one who was accepting appointments. And so when you think about those things, it's, I don't have a safe space at work. I don't have this safe space to pay someone to help me work through my emotions and my experiences. And so people were just kind of at home in the middle of this pandemic, just sitting in their feelings, quite honestly. And there were some of us who had enough energy to get up and do, and then there were some who just could not move. And so we've seen things completely across the board, and how it's been impacting our caregivers. And I think the most important thing is, for as much as Providence acknowledged what was happening, it didn't change the fact that many of us still had to get up and go to work every day and still show up and perform in our jobs. And no one was like, oh, Jessica might be. And I should probably offer a caveat. I joined Providence in September, so I don't want anyone to think that this was my personal experience. But I think for many other people, we were processing these things in a very personal and real way, but also still showing up and being expected to do our jobs as if nothing had happened.
Yeah. And I think that is a sentiment, Jessica, that really permeates throughout so many people in general, but particular BIPOC and Black individuals around this specific issue. And that, you mentioned, I'm not feeling like I can find a care provider for my mental health. I may also feel sort of unsafe or vulnerable at work because of the really difficult conversations that were going on at work. And then let's be honest, frankly, as a Black person, sometimes you just don't feel safe driving home, right? And if I go 2 miles an hour over the speed limit, or go through the wrong neighborhood, or I'm doing the wrong thing at the wrong time, or I change the lane without it, whatever, right? And so it's almost like there's no escape, and you're constantly living trauma. And then even when you seek care, it needs to be trauma-informed care. And I think that's something that's really popped up a lot, right, in this conversation about, particularly around mental health, around trauma, and trauma particularly for BIPOC and Black folks. And so what does that mean for the audience watching, Robin? What is, we say this a lot, trauma-informed care, but what does that actually mean?
Trauma-informed care is a concept that really takes a look at not what happened to you, but what matters to you. And how we show up in trauma-informed care is less interested in how I, as the provider, I'm thinking about what is the information I need to check off. I walk in my mental health evaluation, and I need to know, all of these very intrusive questions in order to get my forms done so that I can, go ahead and bill for you and see you as a patient and make that experience great. Trauma-informed care takes that and turns it upside down, and instead leads with, what matters to you? What's going on for you right now? What's the most important thing that we can talk about and we can deal with and we can do today? And changing the way that we look at changing our frame of reference when we approach somebody. And that trauma-informed becomes even broader and bigger when you're considering racial trauma. Because at that stage in the game, and I'm really glad, Jessica, that you brought up the issue of epigenetics and the idea of compounded systemic intergenerational trauma. Even when working with the youth that we work with, I did a show a couple of weeks ago on the impact of racial trauma on mental health in young people. And here are these young people who are talking about the impact, just the feeling when they walk out the door, and the fact that when you leave the safety of your home, the gasp of breath you take in and the armor that you have to put on to interact with the world is heartbreaking. And our kids are carrying that with them where they go. That is something that you learn. That is something that, I think a generation ago, we would have called that, maybe even 5 years ago, we would have called that, quote, resilience. The reality is that's trauma. And there's a big difference between resilience and trauma in that context.
Dr.
I can't help. Oh, go ahead, Jessica, please.
I was just going to add that, it's not just our children, it's also our caregivers. When I think about my own experience, someone should really check in on my leader. I've given her a run for her money, but, In October, it was, having a really direct conversation with my leader of, hey, I don't feel safe being in Oregon, and I will not physically be in the state of Oregon during the election. The Proud Boys are really comfortable here, and that makes me incredibly uncomfortable. It meant that, on January 6th, I'm calling my boss again, and I'm like, ma'am, I remember when I told you I was afraid, that thing that's happening on TV, that's why I was afraid. And so, I've spoken to caregivers who've said things like, I asked my husband not to go to work because I was afraid that someone would come up to my window and shoot me because I work in the window of my home. And I know that they've not shared these things with their leaders or with other people in the organization. So when I talk about suffering in silence, but wanting to be seen, like, these are the things that people are saying. But I know that people are not going to share these pieces of information with individuals unless they know that you're safe. And there are a series of things that you do to behave to let people know if you're a safe space or not. And sometimes in us being Nice, we don't let people know that we are a safe space for them.
How has that looked like at an organizational level, Jessica? I'm gonna sort of challenge that a little bit, right? Like this trauma-informed, Doc Robinson just talked about a trauma-informed care on a personal level. And then thank you so much for sharing your experiences and being very real with that. And then, so what does then, if we take this up to the proverbial 50,000 foot level from an organizational standpoint, responding to this trauma, not only in an individual way, but at an organizational level, what does that look like?
I think it starts with, starting with our values and being really clear about how our behavior reflects our values. I think we start there. I think it also then goes to prioritizing funding. I mean, trauma-informed care is not something that the average caregiver or even clinician is trained very well in. And so you need to prioritize dollars to hire consultants where this is all that they've studied. This is all that they've done. There are actually pockets of people who have been waiting for this moment. There's a professional, Dr. Sarah King, who has been studying the connection of mindfulness and social justice for 20 years. And people told her she was crazy. And then 2020 showed up and she's turning down all the work. So I think there's an investment of making sure that we're hiring the right people. And then once you have that consultant, then taking a look at your values and making them more specific through your processes and your procedures. So that means policy revisions. It means updating your job descriptions. It means making sure that the behaviors that you expect are explicit. And I think it can be challenging because we try to move at the pace of the readiness of the organization, but I think there's tension between that and the need of what the organization needs to do.
I want to bounce off that a little bit with some experience that we had in behavioral health last year. After the murder of George Floyd, we wanted to convene a conversation. We're working in mental health. Our caregivers in mental health especially have been the repository for many of the caregiver experiences, and we need a place to process and talk to. So we attempted to set a table very early on to have some open dialogue about how are people doing? How are you holding up in the middle of this, knowing that you're hearing and dealing with everybody's trauma here, and we've got to make sure there's a safe place for you to talk about. And we were too early. And it was threatening for some parts of the organization for us beginning to have those conversations, because I don't know exactly what there's a variety of different levels of fear that come in here. But I think the biggest learning that we all took from that was just because you're not talking about it doesn't mean it goes away. The trauma is still there. The conversations are still happening. It's just underground. So I think as people of Providence, we've got to get really, really comfortable really, really fast with conversations that may make us uncomfortable.
And I think continue having those conversations, right? There was a culture last year of sort of May 25th through, I'll say, end of September, maybe even into October. There was a culture of, I can say these things and feel comfortable because I know that at least to save face, my organization is going to say the right thing. I know that at least, even if it's just to save face, my leader, my boss, the people I work with are going to say the right thing. But when I come to you and I say, this is uncomfortable, those actions are racially motivated. We need to look at the racial implications of what you are doing. Me as a clinician in the hospital and how we treat individuals who are patients, how we treat each other, all of those different things, all of the things that I do in the media. No, you can't say that, right? There was a culture of that, and that's now gone away, right? I feel back to, as a queer Black man, almost wanting to center whiteness and make sure that my white colleagues are comfortable, even though I might call something out racially. And so I love that you bring that up, Doc Rob, and I would love to hear from both of you, sort of from a Providence standpoint. How are we taking that energy and that motivation of making the right change and creating this culture so that we can continue to say things, and that particularly clinicians and everyone involved in the Providence global sphere or world feel comfortable continuing to have these conversations? And that's a lot, by the way. I just threw a big old question at you. But you know, kind of what is Providence sort of doing to say, okay, May through October last year, we were cool having these conversations, and now it's sort of like pandemic's easing up, everyone's going back, and now let's kind of go back to normal before. And I'll tell you, I don't know a Black person who wants to go back to normal, right?
I would even add that Black people don't have it's no longer an option. Whatever was happening before, that version of me is no longer accessible. My mask, I misplaced it somewhere between May and 2020, May and June of 2020. It's just not accessible. I think for some of us, it truly is just modeling the behavior, you know, coming into Providence. You know, my heart and the core of who I am is very much like, oh, I should have been here all along. But I think how I show up stands out differently than maybe the culture of Providence. And so for me, I say the hard things and I let there be silence. I push in talent conversations, and I'm modeling the way so that other people can have the courage to do the same thing. And unfortunately, sometimes this work is one by one. You know, there's this concept, and I don't know if it's ethicsy, but it essentially says that if I, as a learner, watch someone else learn how to do something and they do it, then I instantly have more confidence that I'm able to do it. So as a leader, I intentionally reveal myself in certain ways and show up in certain ways because I'm trying to model the behavior so that other people can feel comfortable doing it. And so that is all the way from being on a call with executives when the verdict for Derek Chauvin came out and not turning off my camera and letting them see the amount of pain that I had been containing for the last 9 months. It means that when I'm in a talent review, I'm gonna, you know, you let me do the reflection, I'm going to give you a reflection that, you know, continues to highlight these disparities that show up in healthcare for the various communities. It means that I'm going to ask these difficult questions. And it means that when we say Prov Nice, I'm the person who's going to ask the question of what are we doing to move the needle to be more direct and to empower, enable our leaders to be able to have more challenging conversations.
You know, and I look at the things, you know, the tangible things. We have units where this is still very much a present conversation, very much a present issue. And we're making sure that those conversations are still happening and that people have an opportunity to just talk. Because in mental health, that's the bread and butter of what we do, and we need to be having and continuing the conversation. But it also means we need to be looking at how do we remove the barriers so that we can hire more Black and BIPOC individuals into therapy positions? How do we remove barriers to getting people licensed, removing barriers to getting people even into school to begin with? How do we make this look different so that we can do that? And that means I spend a lot of my time working with the folks in the legislature to bring forward bills that are going to change the way that we train people and we make it more accessible to Black and BIPOC individuals. It means when I'm looking at hiring now, and I'm talking to my teams, I'm like, we have better change things around so that we can ensure that if the people that I'm hiring all look like me, then I need another pool of candidates. That's the bottom line.
You're absolutely right. That's something that we're doing in the HR space. We're essentially, we are.
It's telephone day, isn't it?
It is telephone day. Sorry about technical issues there. I think I dropped off as well, but hopefully you can hear me now.
We can. There you are.
Sorry, and I'm back. And in the HR space, you know, starting with the executive levels, we're looking at making sure that we have diverse slates and hiring we're looking at representation. It's more of a outfront question, an intentional focus on diversity. And of course, it is around gender representation and ethnicity, but then also diversity of experiences, because we see the numbers of knowing that we have better health outcomes when we have those representation for our caregivers, and also more importantly for our patients. And we need to continue to move the needle with that. And so you're seeing more positions that are being posted externally, and you're seeing more direct conversations around what are we doing to improve representation.
Which is really fantastic that, I think sometimes people feel really, I guess, for lack of a better term, feel some kind of way about being intentional about these things. But I think I love that you use that word, because it's so important. Intentional in hiring practices, intentional in these conversations. And in particular, we just have a couple of minutes left. And Doc Rob, I wanted to switch just a little bit about intentionality of making sure that your mental health provider is advocating for your whole care, for your trauma-informed care intentionally. How, as clinicians watching, anyone watching, with their mental health provider, how can they sort of be intentional about making sure that their trauma-related experiences are well taken care of by that mental health provider?
I think part of this comes to trusting your gut. I'll be honest, not all mental health providers are good at dealing with intergenerational trauma, with racial trauma, with institutional bias. Even not all mental health providers understand their own implicit bias, and how some of the way that we've learned therapy is actually not really trauma informed. So if you're in a therapeutic relationship with somebody and your gut is saying they don't get me, that's okay. Find a new provider, because the reality is, it's that quality of the relationship and not necessarily the therapy that's occurring that's going to have the biggest impact for you. One of the blessings of the pandemic has been an incredible increase in access to teletherapy. And teletherapy has been an awesome expansion. It's been how we've been able to reach communities and be able to use the providers that we have who do have skills in this arena to target and be able to be more available to people, even though they may not live down the road from them. So really it comes down to that fit between you and your provider, and call it out, because candidly, mental health providers need to hear the feedback if they're not meeting the mark.
I think that's an amazing point. And as you can see, scrolling across the bottom of the screen there, to find a mental health provider or any provider related to Providence, please, of course, visit providence.org. We have just a couple of minutes left, and I sort of wanted to give each of you an opportunity to provide sort of your personal reflection, if you will, as it relates to Providence and clinicians and those watching, your personal reflection on sort of where we are now, a year later after George Floyd's murder, and where we're going to go from here. Are you feeling hopeful? What are the things that you think are the most urgent as an organization that can really be identified? And then maybe even individually, what are the things that we can all do to work on our implicit biases, right? Work on our own racial equity that needs to happen inside to the outside. So, Jessica, I think I'll pick on you first. Kind of reflect on where you are now and where you see us going forward.
If you asked me a question, I can no longer hear. So can you give me a thumbs up if you did ask me a question?
I did.
Okay, you did ask me a question. So I was reading your lips, so I think I know what you asked, but when I think about opportunities for the future for more sustainable things that we'll need to do in our organization, I would say the first piece is listening to our employees. We have an upcoming caregiver engagement survey. What we typically see in the engagement space is that employees tell us the same thing year over year. Are we really listening and moving the needle with the things that they're telling us? I would say one of the most important things is to move to action faster. As a HR professional, I'm torn between what we know about learning and how when there's a fear response in learning, then people are not actually learning. And the fact that we just need to move faster. I am not a clinician, but what I do know is that when people are diagnosed with cancer, and I would offer that the impact of cancer is comparable to the impact of racial systemic racism. It's not like, oh, this person's not ready to go through this process, let's ease them into it. It's like, no, get the cancer out their body, let's gut it out. And you move with a sense of urgency because you understand the damage that can be done to the rest of the host if you let that cancer continue to sit there. And I think the same thing is true for systemic racism. If we do not move faster, we will lose our caregivers. We are seeing that, not necessarily at Providence, that people are realizing that they can opt out. We are seeing women leave the workforce because they have to take care of childcare because of what's happening in COVID. So this concept of people need jobs so they will work is no longer a thing. We saw droves of Black and brown men and women leave the workforce in 2020 and start their own businesses. People are opting out and saying, I no longer want to engage in this system in this way. And so I think we have to educate ourselves as leaders.
We lost Jessica.
Yeah, I think
Sorry. And then
there we
lastly,
go.
say the last piece is that there needs to be a better integration of mindfulness into how we do work every day. We are humans and we all have things and triggers inside of us that keep us from showing up the way that we want to at work. And without mindfulness to kind of give us that reset and to think from a place that's not rooted in fear, I'd love to see mindfulness, not just, at 12 o'clock on our calendars, but maybe at the start of meetings and integrate it into the way we get our work done.
I love that. That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica. And Doc, I want to give you just a real briefly, sort of 30 seconds. We're right at time right now, but if you just have sort of a quick reflection on where we are now going forward.
I think the biggest reflection that I give you as a white ally is to remember that it's not up to our Black colleagues to tell us how to do this work. It's up to us to do the work. We need to show up for Providence.
Oh, amen. Thank you, Doc Robinson. I knew I needed to give you the last 10 seconds of this. Okay, so obviously, these are really intense, kind of sort of amazing and wonderful conversations, but it's hard to have them in half an hour. So I feel like good work was done here, but it's just a continuation of the part of the work that happens individually as well as at Providence. So for everyone watching, thank you so much. Thank you for putting up with our technical issues. I'm not even 100% sure you can hear me right now, but I'm just going to keep acting like you can. So I appreciate that. We all have so much work to do together. And Doc Rob, thank you for putting a nice little button on that at the end there in terms of the work that white folks need to do going forward. So thank you so much for all of this. And thank you, Dr. Robin. Thank you, Jessica, for joining us today. Everyone listening, sending in questions. I know there were some questions under there, but I really wanted to keep this conversation with y'all. If you are looking for help with your mental health or other medical advice, please, of course, visit providence.org and make sure you follow Providence on social media, Providence on Twitter, and under Providence Health System on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We will continue the conversation. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.